Why you should have an overinflated basketball. I'm Tony. Welcome back to Streetball Strategies.
Don't let me tell you again, I'm coming to win, so get out the way. Don't let me tell you again, I'm coming to win and coming to lose it. Don't let me tell you again, I'm coming to win, so get out the way.
Today we're talking about ball inflation and why I think you should have your basketball be overinflated as opposed to being regularly, standardly inflated. This applies mostly to practice and training, though I guess you could use it, you could implement it while you playing games and competing. But for the most part, I find overinflating your basketball is a good strategy to take in terms of trying to put an element into your training and practice that other players, lesser players, less serious players are not doing, and will give you a competitive advantage if you use it on a regular basis. So today we're going to talk about what I mean by overinflating a basketball. We're going to talk about how it can help you in games and practice, and how you might even want to implement it in actual competition. Let's start with talking about standard basketball inflation. So on most basketballs, around the inflation point, you'll see writing that'll tell you to inflate a basketball to a certain PSI or a certain many ounces that the manufacturer recommends for optimal performance. And usually that works out perfectly fine. The manufacturer knows what PSI or how many ounces they want their basketball to be inflated to, and when you do that, the ball usually bounces and performs just fine. I have experienced cases here and there though where you'll do that, you'll have that PSI or that many ounces that you're supposed to inflate the ball to, and just for whatever reason it just won't bounce the way you expect it. It won't bounce correctly. And so you can't always trust the manufacturer's recommendations to how much you should inflate your basketball. Now I've seen a general rule before which says, like, if you're trying to determine how inflated your basketball should be, you should hold it straight out in front of you and drop it, and then it should bounce to a certain height. It should come back up to a certain height, and if it does that, then your ball is perfectly inflated, and then you should go on from there. What I'm looking for in terms of a ball's bounciness, of how much air and inflation it has, I don't want to have to think about it. I don't want to have to notice it. So when you're dribbling, for instance, you don't want to have to think about the ball being a little bit underinflated or a little bit overinflated and have that be like a little bit of a distraction in your mind. When you dribble the ball, when you handle the ball just casually, you want to have it feel natural. So you're not thinking about, okay, the ball's not bouncing high enough, or it's bouncing a little too high, and giving you just that little bit of a distraction. The less you have to think about stuff like how is the ball bouncing, the more you can actually focus on your game, on your practice, on your training. It's not a distraction, it doesn't get in the way. So in general, I would say in terms of inflation, the way you would standardly inflate a basketball, it should just be all about what do you like, what works for you the best. And usually I find the less I have to think about how much air is in here, how high or low it's bouncing, the better that works for me. So now let's talk about why I think for most of the time, especially practice and training, you should have your ball be overinflated. First of all, what do I mean by overinflated? Well, basically what I mean is putting more air in here than you're used to. What you're trying to accomplish is having the ball bounce more than you're used to. Most of the time, you would have the ball inflated to a point where it's comfortable for you, where you get the kind of handling performance out of it that you expect. But when I say overinflating, now you're intentionally trying to make the ball bouncier, because it forces you to pay attention to the details, to the little things of how the ball's moving, how it's bouncing, how hard it's coming off, whether it be the ground or the backboard or the basket, right? You have to really pay attention to what you're doing so that you have as much control as you can. Because the more air the ball has, the more it bounces, right? The less control you have over the basketball. The less control you have over the basketball, the more you have to think about everything you're doing in terms of controlling the basketball. The more you have to think, the more you're paying attention to the details, the more skill you are building and the deeper that skill is becoming, because it gives you a better understanding of how the ball behaves, how it operates, and what you need to do physically to impose the kind of control you need to have the kind of performance you're looking for. It falls under my general philosophy of make practice and training hard, difficult on yourself to make the games and competition feel easier. It's the idea of if you practice and train absolutely as hard as you can, if you make it as difficult on yourself as you possibly can, then in competition, no opponent should be able to make you feel uncomfortable because you've already pushed that uncomfortability by yourself on yourself during practice and training. So in comparison, any opponent that you come across in competition is going to seem relatively easy or easier because nothing can be as hard as your practices or your training. One of my favorite and most consistent ways of doing this is to practice with an overinflated basketball. So you may be asking, well, how much should I inflate the basketball? Well, that's going to be up to you and your preference, and individual basketballs are going to react differently to their inflation level. But for me, I like to keep it simple, right? What I do is I inflate the basketball as much as I possibly can. So I'll get the pump, I start pumping the basketball, and just until I start to feel that little bit of resistance, right? When you're pumping, and you'll feel it. You'll feel the pump start to give you resistance because the ball is basically full of air. You don't want to go past that point. You don't want to push it, right? Because now you're in danger of damaging the basketball or the pump or the pin, or you don't want any damage to occur. I just want to get as much air in here as I can. So I do that until I get the resistance of the pump. I can, just by feeling the basketball, I can feel that it's inflated to its capacity. Take that pump off, and now it's got as much air as it can possibly have in it without doing damage to the basketball, and now it's ready to use and practice with. I've never had a basketball have any damage to a basketball from overinflating them, and I've been doing it for 25 years. Basketballs that don't have very good construction, they don't have very good materials used to make them when they're manufactured, those basketballs, when you overinflate them, it's still unlikely that you're going to do damage or pop that basketball. However, I found that those basketballs, when you overinflate them, especially when you inflate them to like max capacity like I do, some of them on occasion you may get like a crazy over the top ridiculous bounce where the ball bounces way too much. At that point, it's no longer helpful when a ball is crazily overinflated, and because it has cheap materials made out of it, it bounces way too crazily. Like to that point, that's not helpful. Usually that never happens with higher quality basketballs, like average, even lower average basketballs. But sometimes if you happen to have a cheaper made basketball, that can definitely happen. In that case, I would say do what you can, like inflate it to the point where you get a little bit more bounce, but you don't have to do like max capacity inflation like I do. Just get a little bit more bounce than you're used to, but don't get that super crazy bounce if you happen to come across that. So if you've never overinflated your basketball before, you've never tried to go for that sort of max capacity inflation for your basketball to give you a significant increase in how much the basketball bounces, I encourage you to at least try it. It's going to be frustrating, right? because you're gonna have way more bounce than you're used to, especially when it comes to like shooting, right? You're gonna have the ball. First of all, the ball's gonna be heavier, a little bit heavier than you're used to. It's probably not gonna feel crazily heavier, but you will notice a significant increase in its weight. When you shoot the ball, when you get rebounds, it hits off the rim, you're gonna have higher, longer, faster rebounds, and that's probably going to be frustrating, but it's supposed to be. That's the point. You're supposed to deal with that, right? You're supposed to compensate for it, and you're supposed to sharpen your skills so that you shoot better, so you have less rebounds, so you have to chase less rebounds. But even in the case where you're having to chase rebounds down because the ball is at max capacity for inflation, right? I say embrace that, and consider that part of your conditioning training, right? So now you have, I always say to run after your own rebounds. Don't walk after them. There's no point in doing that. You're not gaining anything by walking after your rebounds. Run, if not sprint, after all of your rebounds. And when your ball is at max capacity, you're gonna have high, fast, long rebounds that you're gonna have to run, if not sprint for, and that can only serve to better your game. That is why you should overinflate your basketball. One of my favorite reasons for doing this, and one of the pillars that this channel is built on, is when you're doing this, it's something that other players are not doing, like lesser players, less serious players are not doing. It's a small little detail. It's not a big deal. It's not gonna skyrocket your game, but it's gonna add a little bit of a layer onto your game that other players, lesser players, less serious players are not doing. This channel is meant for any basketball player, but it's intended more specifically for those of us who we don't have traditional basketball or athletic talent. So because of that, we have to use any and everything we can think of to make our skills comparable to those players that do have standard average basketball or athletic talent. Doing something small like overinflating your basketball in practice and training, so you have sharper skills than you normally would, that's a small thing, but it's something that probably nobody else is doing. Think, ask the people around you, ask the players around you, ask your friends, do they do that? Like, have they thought of it? Probably not, right? Because they're not taking the game as serious as you are, so they're not taking their training and their practice as seriously as you are, so they're not doing these small things like overinflating your basketball on purpose to make it more difficult on yourself. And this channel is all about taking these small little strategies, putting them together over time to really build your game and give you advantages out here that no one else has, because you're doing stuff, thinking about stuff, having, a mindset about things that no other players probably out here have. And lastly, on the note of competing, playing games with overinflated basketballs. Now, I don't encourage you to do this. I don't recommend it. I think when you play the game, you take air out of the basketball, so now it bounces properly again. It has the average bounce of an average basketball. It's the principle of, okay, you had to have way more control, way more concentration on the basketball in practice because it was overinflated, but now because it's game time, competition time, where it really matters, now you take that extra air out and it's back to normal. Now you kind of feel like you have even more control than normal over a basketball. There can be the advantage where if you overinflate your basketball and you bring it out for games and competitions, you probably be the only one that's used to the ball being disinflated and thus having extra bounce. But as I've said many times before, you come out to a public park, especially if you come out and playing with and against strangers, people just want to use their own basketball. Players usually insist on using their own basketball, meaning even if you come out to the park and your ball is clearly better than everybody else's, it usually is not going to matter, because strangers are going to want to use their basketball regardless of the fact that yours is better. But number one, it's unlikely that they're going to use your basketball because they just want to use theirs, and they're not going to allow you to use yours because of that, because they think their ball gives them a competitive advantage over you. And number two, you got to keep in mind, you're going to have teammates, right? And if your teammates, if they're not used to playing with a overinflated basketball that bounces way more than they're used to, that's going to be a detriment to your teammates as well as your opponent. So because of that, I don't usually recommend using an overinflated basketball for games and competition. Just use it for training and practice, and then when it comes to games, go back to using normal inflation for your basketball. So I want to thank you guys for watching. If you like this video, if you found it helpful, if you think it's going to help improve the way you practice and train for your games, then please subscribe to the channel. Also, make sure you hit that thanks button down below. When you hit that thanks button, any comment that you make to let me know what you prefer when it comes to inflation of your basketball. all of those comments are going to be highlighted down below, so it's going to stick out from any other comment. Not only that, but hitting that thanks button directly supports the channel, and for anyone that does that, thank you very much. As always, like, share, comment like I said. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified whenever any video goes live on this channel, and until then, I will see you guys next week.
You couldn't say I didn't warn you, call me informer, headed across the waters. Hotter than saunas, feeling important. I had to cut the shortcut, taking a long way. I got the sauce, I'm looking to saute. This is an off day, but still working, so get out of harm's way.